Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to you. I'm Ahmad Izdiha, your MC for segment B, you know, for this afternoon. All right. We have two esteemed speakers moderated by architect Serena Hijaz. Okay, the speakers are actually from Responsibility Services, Chief Executive Officer. His name is Mr. Pramod Das, and he's going to talk about the building block of green finance. Okay, second speaker for today's session, afternoon session actually, Datuk Sri Sunita Rajakumar. She's the founder of Climate Governance Malaysia, and she will be talking on financing the transition. All right. So I hope you all had a rest. After segment A, now we are in segment B, and it's afternoon. It's going to rain soon. All right. So let's not hold back any longer. On to you, Serena.
Hi, good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to day two of IJM's Financing Climate Action. I think this is a very timely webinar with regards to financing green, that to move forward for the next 10 years. I think this will definitely be the big shift and move that we're looking for in our climate, but also in our economy. Part two of this segment is energizing green finance for sustainability. And we have two very well-known speakers that will be coming onto the platform today. The first will be Pramod Das, who is basically the Chief Executive Officer of RAM Sustainability. Let's look at RAM Sustainability. RAM Sustainability is a provider of sustainable services and ESG analytics. Prasad himself is essentially formerly the Deputy CEO of RAM Rating Services Berhad. Pramod has over 25 years in financial services industry, including 20 years at RAM Group. He has been spearheading RAM Group's involvement in the United Nations supported principles for responsible investments. PRI, as it's known, statement on ESG in credit ratings specifically. Pramod is also a member of PRI's advisory committee on credit ratings. So with such an established track record in the banking credit rating analysis since 2000, he is a thought leader for the Malaysian and Asian bond markets and Islamic finance. So this webinar and speech will be done by Pramod Das is actually a recording. Unfortunately, in terms of timing, he's unavailable to be here in person, but we really look forward to this recording from Pramod Das.
My name is Pramod from RAM Sustainability, and I'm here to share views on the building blocks for green finance. I'm going to share with you perspectives that I've gathered, both as a credit rating analyst for the last 20 years with RAM, and more recently, over the last 5 years, when I've looked at environment, social, and governance issues in credit rating, and in my context, leading the sustainability and ESG analytics at RAM Group under RAM Sustainability. So let me get down to business now. I often use this this chart because it sums up everything quite neatly. You have the savers on one end, the UNI, the institutional depositors, and this savings fuels the financial economy. It goes through other institutional investors. It goes through intermediaries like banks or foundations and exchanges. And this money takes into account views from the market, equity analysts, credit analysts, and so on, and forms a view, and it goes and it gets channeled into the economy. It can either end up into one of the 17 SDGs or into other uses. So how this money behaves actually dictates how the planet will be, because this money is also now part of an investment chain that has regulation and laws that guide it, and whole thing is connected in a shell. But there is something that is changing very fast. That is that money is gaining a conscience. Money is looking at the environment, social, and governance. And I want you to remember 6 R's in this. First, realize where you are in this food chain. Are you part of the financial economy? Are you part of the real economy? Are you part of the investment chain? Are you with government? And once you realize, you also will soon realize that you are responsible, the second R, for where the money goes, because you are part of the decision-making process. You will also start to realize that what are the risks that could happen if you do not make the right decisions or the appropriate decisions. There's also another R, returns. You, of course, want commensurate returns for the money that you're investing, but looking at the world today, you realize that you need to consider people and planet. And the reality, the next R, the reality, if you don't make those correct decisions, the repercussions that you'll have, either in the form of haze, climate change, pandemics, all the things that nowadays they're calling green swan events or rainbow swan events, major events that can affect the world, streaming from either the biodiversity issues or from the climate. So the final R will be effectively reputation. If you're anywhere part of this investment chain and you're harming the planet or harming people, then reputation will be impacted. So remember the 6 R's: realize where you are, know that you're responsible, realize the risk that you are adding on to the system if you do not make the right decisions. The returns need to include the planet and people. The reality, what happens when you do not make the right decisions. And finally, the reputational impact that will have on you. So bear this in mind as I go through the next few slides. So summing up neatly all the issues to do with green or sustainability are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17. My favorite one is Sustainable Development Goal 17, which is almost always the unsung hero, because this involves collaboration, but most of what happens tangibly actually happens because of collaboration. You have SDG 17, which is on climate action, but the important point that I want to bring across here is the SDGs basically gave birth to the other areas that give more traction to green finance or sustainable finance. You have industry guidelines that govern green bonds or green sukuk. For those of you who are not familiar with a bond, basically it is an IOU given by a company broken up into small parts, and basically it's a loan that's shared among investors. And you have the ASEAN Green, Social and Sustainability Bond Standards. You have the Climate Bond Standards. You have the Green Bond Principles, and you have the Sustainable Responsible Investment Sukuk Framework by the Securities Commission. So that's a whole set of guidelines that governs green bonds or sustainable bonds. But on the other side, you have the regulators that control money or exchanges. So the central bank and the Securities Commission are part of the Joint Committee on Climate Change in Malaysia. You have the Islamic banks in Malaysia driving value-based intermediation. You have the Network for Greening of Financial Systems. They are basically a network of central banks where Bank Negara is part of it. You have the sustainable stock exchanges, and all companies on the sustainable stock exchange such as Bursa have to have sustainability reporting. So there has been a lot of disclosure. This disclosure is then used by investors and banks and insurance companies that are looking at ESG factors and integrating it in their risk assessment. So ESG is becoming more and more part of the environment, social risk assessment that a credit analyst or an equity analyst or insurance analyst looks at. And just to give you an idea of the traction all of this is giving over the last few years. If I just look at the principles of responsible investing, signatory base, and the amount of assets under management, the assets under management in 2006 was about 6.5 trillion US dollars, and they had about 60 odd signatories. Today, the same principles of responsible investing, assets under management is close to about 103 trillion with 3,000 over signatories. Closer to home, to give you a bit more perspective, the Employees Provident Fund, Khazanah, Kumpulan Wang, the QAP Pension Fund, the Government Pension Fund, are signatories to the PRI. Then you have other initiatives such as the Equator Principle, where you look at ESG for project finance, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure. You have the principles of responsible banking. You have many banks globally that are part of that. And you have all these coming together and driving money to have the conscience to look at the environment and social factors. Now, these then translate to instruments in the form of climate or green bonds or green sukuk. You have sustainable development goals, sukuk or bonds. Basically, these green bonds would focus on green eligible projects. Sustainable development goal bonds or sukuk will invest or have their proceeds go across the 17 SDGs, so Sustainable Development Goals. You have sustainability linked financing or sukuk or bonds or loans. Effectively, these are loans or bonds that are KPI linked to a particular trigger. So it could be a lowering of your emission, or if you are having you're in a polluting industry and you're able to reduce the amount of pollutants. These are some of the triggers that you can use for sustainability linked loans. For transition sukuk, of course, or transition bonds, it can look holistically at a particular company. It could be a company that is in a brown industry that is deciding to go 25% green, and investors come in and support and invest in that space. The green finance also looks at supply chain financing or even halal supply chain financing, where effectively banks or investors want to understand the environment, social governance factors in the supply chain. So all this comes together neatly in the Securities Commission Malaysia's Sustainable Responsible Investment Sukuk Framework that came out in 2014. That was about the same time that the Bursas started sustainability reporting. We've recently, in September 2019, you have the Joint Committee on Climate Change by the SC and Bank Negara. There's a green taxonomy in December 2019. So you can see in Malaysia, a lot of things are moving green, a lot of things are moving sustainably. Under the eligible SRI projects, you have about 10 green utilization areas. For the social, you have 6. Social includes things like affordable housing, green includes things like renewable energy, just to give you a bit more perspective if you can't see the slide so clearly, and a wakaf, which is the amount that or land you bequeath. So, of course, it's definitely can be used for green buildings. And let me elaborate a bit more on what are climate bonds. Climate bonds are a subset of green bonds, and you can use it in the context of green buildings, clean transportation, sustainable water and wastewater treatment, and renewable energy. And there are three main principles that the market is driven by: the green bond principles, the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, and the Green SRI Sukuk framework. Let me give you the context of climate bonds and green bonds. Globally, green bonds are about 260 billion US dollars, and climate bonds have a 17% share of the green bond market. The green building component of certified climate bonds has been growing. If you look at this, this chart, from 2015 to 2019, you can actually see the green bonds, that's the for use for green buildings. The orange one with the green building attached to it, you can actually see it grow from 2015 to 2019. So there is a lot of opportunity for green buildings to get funded by green bonds in the market. And essentially, when you look at issuing a green bond or a green sukuk, you need to look at four areas: the utilization of proceeds. It needs to go into eligible green projects, and in the case of the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, no fossil fuel can be funded. And for SRI Sukuk framework, it is both the green and social projects. Secondly, the other area that you need to look at when you're issuing a green bond is project evaluation and selection. And you need to look at criteria, how it fits into your eligible green project categories. And management of the proceeds, you need to ensure that the proceeds are ring-fenced with proper internal controls, because investors look at this. One key element of a green bond or green sukuk is reporting commitments. So if you're an investor, if you are investing in a green bond or green sukuk, you actually have a lot more information in terms of the utilization of proceeds and the impact reporting. And so in essence, the ASEAN Green Bond Standards and the SRI Sukuk framework have many similarities with the key principles in the green bond principles. I just want to show you some of the transactions that have happened since 2017. There are 10 out of the 17 green sukuk internationally come from Malaysia. 5 out of the 17 green sukuk relate to green buildings. So there was the PNB tower that is coming up. There is the MAF sukuk in the UAE, and there was one other green building bond, but that's not in this list because it is a conventional bond. So you can see that you can finance the green buildings, and I will end finally by going back to the original slide. So the building blocks for green finance or sustainability, you can actually sum it up simply as if you draw the letter S and draw a line through it, sustainability and green needs to be aligned with the profitability. you need to again look at where you are in the financial food chain or the real economy. You need to consider the responsibility that you wield in terms of where the money goes, the risks of not making the right decisions, the returns. You need to include people and planet, the reality. If it doesn't go into an SDG, it goes into a polluting industry, the repercussions such as haze or COVID or anything that's harming the planet. And finally, the impact, the reality that is going to have on your reputation. So with that, thank you very much. And I hope you've got a good understanding of the building blocks of green and sustainable finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pramod. That was, in fact, a very interesting talk. I was completely illuminated and gave me a very in-depth in terms of the prospect for us to go green with regards to climate bond and green bond. And very interesting that a lot of the transactions, 10 out of the 17 transactions have actually been, oh, sorry. I'm not on mute. Yeah. Can I be heard? Can everyone hear me? Thank you very much, Pramod Das. That was an incredible outline on climate bond and green bond. I find it very illuminating to know that 17 out of 17 projects, 10 transactions actually came from Malaysia. And the spectrum of climate bond covers essentially everything to do with green buildings, waste energy, renewable energy. So this gives us a good indication that the market as well as industry is ready to move forward in support of green financing. The next speaker that we have today is Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar. She's a professional independent director and strong advocate of the importance of governance in general and risk management in particular. She founded Climate Governance Malaysia, the country chapter of the World Economic Forum's Climate Governance. She's a fellow of the Institute of Corporate Directors Malaysia, promotes gender diversity on boards with the 30% Club, a member of the Global Advisory Board, and this will be an interesting view that we will have on her talk, which will be on financing the transition by Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar, founder of Climate Governance Malaysia, or CGM as it's known. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Serena, for that welcome. And I also want to thank the Malaysian Green Building Council as well as MGTC for inviting me to give this keynote. So I just wanted to recap, when we speak about financing the transition, why is this important to us? Well, this is something that our Bank Negara governor just said a few weeks ago. She views that climate change is an existential threat to humanity, and financial institutions are exposed to liability risks, asset impairment, and rising claims arising from climate-related risk. These risks are already clear and present, and they are going to intensify if we do not take steps to alter course. From the Network for Greening of Financial Systems, the chair and Sarah Breeden from Bank of England, they have also concurred. Impacts are going to be far-reaching in breadth and in magnitude. They are uncertain and yet at the same time totally foreseeable. And we know that the size and balance of these future financial risks and economic costs are going to depend on the actions we take today. Put another way, there are three ways in which the destruction of biodiversity and ecosystems create risks for business, because businesses are dependent on nature, that there's going to be a fallout of business impacts on nature, and there's going to be impacts in society as well. So let's take a look at this. Does this really have anything to do with me? When does this actually really happen? 4 or 5 years ago, wildfire was not at the top of the list of climate impacts. People were likely to be worried about rising sea levels and hurricanes, about eventually losing polar bears and coral reefs. And at that point, 2050 to 100 was just like remote experiences. But now, what is absolutely clear are these three things. Climate risk is today's risk. You turn on your TV and you watch these fires happening, you're going to have difficulty breathing. It's going to keep happening now and forever. Number two, climate risk is financial risk. It's not just a humanitarian disaster or a climate justice problem. It's not just economic impact, which you're going to measure in GDP terms, but it's going to result in bankruptcies. It's going to impact your retirement. It's impacting your mortgage insurance capability. It's impacting your real life now. And the third thing is that climate risk is forever risk. This is going to continue forever and ever and get more complex. So these three realizations are here now. And we can either decide we want to experience it, we want to go for an abrupt transition, or we want to try and plan our way out of it, which is what's called a smooth transition. These are the choices we're facing right now. So as we can see in this chart, we've got extreme weather events, we've got impacts on security, there is going to be cheaper renewable energy, new climate research coming out on an almost daily basis, civil society action led by children, no less, regulators, as I pointed out, especially the central banks. Are we going to live in an uninsurable world? And how is this going to affect us? And influence shifting. So investors, allocators of capital are starting to make noise about this now. In Malaysia, we have first-hand experience of how devastating extreme weather events can be to all of us. And all of this can take a long time to rehabilitate or to recover from. In terms of wildfires, if we're looking at fires in California starting from 1932, we can see that the majority of the largest fires are happening this year. This is already happening to us now. So of course, we're very glad to see that world leaders are pledging to halt this sort of destruction. They seem to be committing to reduce deforestation, unsustainable fishing practice, eliminating environmentally harmful subsidies to begin the transition to a greener world. We know that cities can resolve to pivot very quickly if they want to. This is Dubai planning to be the world's lowest carbon footprint city in just 3 decades from now, with 75% of the power from clean energy in 30 years. We can see that companies can pivot very quickly when they decide to do this. So if there's a commodity, for example, that is a leading driver of deforestation, they want to move away from this and manage their carbon footprint. I want to introduce you to a new concept, inevitable policy response. What does this mean? Well, if we think that government action to date has been highly insufficient to achieve Paris commitments, and we know that as the realities of climate change become increasingly apparent, it is inevitable that governments will be forced to act. And if governments are not acting as how we would like them to right now, they will inevitably have to do so in just a few years' time. And so when you have sudden policy changes, this is extremely disruptive. And businesses and industries want to get ahead of that. So a United Nations supported network of investors have come up with principles for responsible investment, and they are developing a framework called inevitable policy response. What does this look like? Well, we already have oil majors making net zero emission pledges. That's an industry that's responding to policy and economics very fast. You have consumer goods companies, like I just shared with you, mining companies, especially with their coal assets, electric car companies, utilities. We're still in the middle of a pandemic, and instead of slowing down, the energy transition to green seems to be picking up pace. Even countries are passing laws requiring carbon neutrality. So this inevitable policy response has come up with a forecast policy scenario. And there are key policies that they are forecasting in detail in this forecast. That coal will be phased out, internal combustion engines are going to be phased out. We will have to work towards zero carbon. Our grid is going to be decarbonized. We must have energy efficiencies, and especially in buildings. We're looking at carbon pricing, carbon capture storage, and industry-wide decarbonization. How can we remove greenhouse gases using forestation policies and more efficient ways of agriculture? So this is broadly under two categories: enabling a green economy and through the lens of a just transition. And this they have translated into a modeling framework where you have macroeconomic inputs, whether land use or energy, and how this leads to value streams and financial implications. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but just be comforted that there are a lot of people looking into this and deciding how they want to allocate their capital. So decarbonizing at scale is achievable, but the math is really daunting. Why is this such a big problem? Because carbon emissions are cumulative. So what we are looking at, the effects that we're looking at right now is as though we are trying to warm up a swimming pool. It takes a really long time, but if you did manage to warm up the swimming pool, it's going to be very, very difficult to cool it down quickly. So if you look at carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years, it's really only in the last few years that we are reaching boundaries which we have never seen before. So this is another way of putting this. The orange line with the dotted arrow is the trajectory that we are currently on. We're currently on track to exceed 2 degrees of warming. So we have different bands of intervention. If we're going to have faster CO2 reductions, which is the blue band, or if we're not going to be able to reduce, and what does that look like for us? United Nations Environment Programme came up with emissions gap report, and there they noted that we are facing a need for emissions reduction, which is becoming steeper and steeper. And at some stage, it's going to be very difficult to achieve 1.5 degrees of warming. Why is that? Because we need 15% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Is this a large amount? I'm not very sure, but this year alone, with our shutdown, with 3/4 of the world being under economic lockdown, CO2 emissions are expected to fall by only 8%. This is during the pandemic. So 15% is quite significant. Here's another way of looking at it. So we have the emissions which are required for a 1.5 degree pathway. This is in blue. And what is very clearly seen is that we need such a steep mitigation that we need the areas in red as well. We need negative emissions. And this means, for example, preserving our forests or having more reforested areas. The network for greening the financial system, which I referred to earlier, is a network of central banks and supervisors. I think there are about 69 central banks and 13 observers that are currently in this grouping. Bank Negara is one of them. They have been doing a lot of work planning how to manage this systemic risk to our financial systems. The International Energy Association's estimate is that to have a 50% chance of limiting the rise in temperatures, only 1/3 of our current fossil fuel reserves can be burnt. This means over 80% of coal reserves have to remain unused. And if that's the case, these unburnable fossil fuels are going to become stranded assets. Stranded assets will result in a 40 to 60% decrease of enterprise valuations. This is what central bankers are estimating. And I mentioned negative emissions just now. Deforestation is continuing at a very rapid rate. That is the dotted red line. So if we're going to need to reverse this, we need to have cumulative afforestation going on, and this is the scale at which we're looking at. It's going to need an estimated 780 billion of offset financing. And that was the good news. The bad news is, while the United Nations IPCC has for a decade used a spread of warming of between 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius, it seems increasingly likely that the minimum increase in temperature is 2.3 degrees Celsius. And at this stage, it's not possible to rule out wildcard, catastrophic, very dangerous outcomes. And there is a significant chance of increasing even beyond 8.1 degrees Celsius. Understandably, the vast majority of people want real change. 86% of people, they want the world to be a fairer and more sustainable place. And this is a survey of 21,000 people in 28 countries. How is this translating in real life actions? We're seeing much more climate-related litigation. So at the beginning of this year, there was 1,400 in at least 33 countries. And the vast majority of these cases are in OECD countries. Let me share with you some examples of what's happening. This is the spread of where these legal cases, climate-related litigation, is taking place now. This is such an interesting case. A Peruvian farmer is suing a German utility company. He is claiming that global warming is melting a glacier, and this is going to cause a lake near his village to overflow. And this is going to mean that hundreds of thousands of people are going to lose their communities and assets. So RWE is the second largest emitter of carbon dioxide in Europe. The fact that the company doesn't operate in Peru is irrelevant. So this farmer is suing for less than 0.5% of the cost that he needs for protective measures, 17,000 euros. But the court in Germany has ruled that this is a well-founded case and you can proceed to gather evidence. So for the first time, the causal link between a company's contribution to global warming and threats to individuals has now been declared legally relevant, irrespective of which country you're in. Children are suing the 5 highest emitting nations that have ratified UN Convention of Rights of the Children, because these countries have violated their rights under this convention by failing to take adequate government action to reduce their GHGs. Closer to home, in the Philippines, the Commission on Human Rights has announced that the world's biggest carbon polluters can be held liable for their role in contributing to climate change. And this is because Philippines sees a disproportionate amount of typhoons and hurricanes. So the Commission has ruled that major fossil fuel companies are morally obligated to respect human rights, and that the existing civil and criminal laws provide grounds for action against these companies. This was a landmark case, Ujenda versus Netherlands, which ruled that the state does owe a duty of care to protect its citizens from climate change. Climate change threatens human rights, and in order to ensure adequate protection, it should be possible to invoke those rights against individual states. And so the state was required to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by at least 25%. In Australia, an individual has commenced proceedings against the pension fund because the pension fund has failed to adequately disclose its strategy on how it's going to manage climate change risks. And this is of public interest nature. In Poland, the courts ruled that investing in a coal-fired power plant was making a stranded asset, and therefore the company and the directors are liable. So back to what the central bankers are saying. They are going to give us examples of how climate change actually affects businesses. You might have, for example, energy transition policies, carbon tax, carbon pricing. This is going to limit the use of fossil fuels. This is going to result in higher costs for some companies. Higher costs and reduced revenues will cut profits and affect future cash flows of these companies. So, from the perspective of the lender, the financial institution, this is going to result in lower asset valuation and higher loan default rates, most probably. The second case was technological innovation. A decline in renewable energy costs is going to reduce the market share and pricing power of what is known as brown companies. This also is going to lead to decreased asset value and higher default rates. So, in financing this transition, companies need to be very clear about how they are managing climate governance. So, governance wraps around the strategy of the business. Strategy is built on risk management, and risk management needs metrics and targets for you to effectively assess and manage climate-related risks and also opportunities. So there's been a lot of conversation that a reliable and universal carbon price would substantially advance climate debates in the boardroom. Because climate change is a classic market failure. The costs of emitting CO2 are borne by society at large, whereas the benefits accrue to those burning fossil fuels. How do we correct this market failure? We need to know the social cost of these carbon emissions. So the central bankers have already estimated, and they think that if you want an orderly transition, which requires planning, then in just 10 years' time, carbon price is likely to be about $100 per ton. That's a lot. There's not a lot of companies that are going to be able to pivot away from that and still be profitable. Swiss Re is one of the world's largest reinsurers. They had been using internal pricing, shadow pricing of $8. They just announced a month ago that starting from next year, they will be using an internal carbon levy of $100 per ton starting from next year. And this is because they view that 1/5 of the world's countries are at risk of their ecosystems collapsing because of the destruction of wildlife and their habitats. And natural services has been damaged by human activity. More than half of the global GDP depends on a high functioning biodiversity, but the risk of tipping points is growing. And this especially relevant to countries which have a strong economic dependence on natural resources. So we have some data by industry, not just what the emissions trajectories are, but also what the trajectory needs to be. So in red, you can see what the current trajectories are, and in blue, what the trajectory needs to be. We need to bend this curve down, whether power sectors or industries such as cement and steel or the transport industry, and of course buildings. Buildings need to be much greener, much more energy efficient than they are right now. And this is industry level. We also have statistics that compare industry average to best practice players. And so the efficiency potential is still significant in all sectors. The examples that are given here are for cement, steel, aviation, and the oil and gas industry. And the biggest improvements are in the oil and gas industry, where upstream methane intensity can be 71% more efficient. So understandably, there are a lot of voices that are saying expectation of boards are high. Good proactive governance is key, and the opposite is often a leading indicator of a firm in trouble. These are the sort of questions that we should be asking ourselves in relation to managing physical risks or transition risks. Physical risks, what are the most material hazards that we can see from extreme weather events? And transition risk, what types of government policies are being considered? Government might be late to the table, but they have a whole arsenal of policies and they can pivot very quickly. The World Economic Forum came up with some guiding principles on how corporate boards can set up effective climate governance. These are the principles that you need to recognize you're accountable. You must have subject command of the subject matter. The board structure must be conducive. Materiality is important. There's a lot of greenwashing going on. Is sustainability embedded into the DNA of your business? Strategic integration throughout the organization. Ensure that incentives are aligned. Reporting and disclosure is key because without measuring it, you will not be able to effectively manage it. Exchange of information is very important because we are all moving into new worlds. The first principle, climate accountability, very clearly states that the board, as long-term stewards of the company, must be accountable for the company's long-term resilience, and failure to do so may constitute a breach of directors' duties. In the SDGs, Goal 13, which is climate change, is also requiring data-driven action. You are going to need an emissions reduction target, which is science-based, if you want to keep up with the scale of reductions required. 61% of companies interviewed in that report already have at least one significant carbon reduction target. And more than 80% say that climate ambition affects their investment decisions. So this is the scale of the impact that's happening on businesses already. Because when instances like this are going to be more prevalent, people, companies, businesses, industries are going to be looking around to see who can bear the bill for this sort of damage and destruction. So you need to be very clear. Are you part of the solution or are you going to be part of the problem? So when we think about financing this transition, we need to make a journey which is a multi-decade transition that's deeply complicated. We are entering the decisive decade of humanity. The key insight that we know today, scientifically, is that to be able to deliver on Paris, it's not just about decarbonizing the world's energy system. We need to maintain our biodiversity. We need to transform the world's food system. We need to maintain the carbon sinks, our jungles and our forests. We can't have a successful business on a dead planet. So we know that environmental sustainability and commercial sustainability are one and the same thing. This transition must be one of the most significant transformations in economic history, and it's very likely that the asset class of net zero assets is going to become a very significant asset class. If 20 years ago we thought that catastrophic change was potentially at 5 to 6 degrees Celsius warming, it is now down to 2 degrees Celsius of warming. So we have true reason to start considering declaring a state of planetary emergency now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, I'm back. Thank you very much. Am I live? I'm live now. All right. Thank you very much, Datin Sri Sunita. I think that was, I'm not sure whether to be afraid of the future or embrace it, but I guess looking forward, the aspects of financing this transition period, and we all know that we only have this 10 years of a window to bring most of our emissions down and be carbon accountable for our actions, especially at the corporate levels, I think is very, very important. And the inevitable policy response for investors to be responsible is certainly a good action that should be adopted by a lot of corporations. In fact, we have seen when we were doing the sustainable goals and sustainable leadership that certain corporations are already adopting and making it one of their main policy of change and transition for this period. The good corporate governance to take on these financial transition and reducing our future risk is of the utmost importance. We will be hosting a Q&A session for the next 10 minutes, and you may actually put up any of your questions that you have. These will be answered by email by MGBC, who will be basically moderating with the professionals that we've just heard from Datin Sri and also from Prasad. And we welcome any questions that you have, whether it's at a corporate level or personal level, in terms of financing the transition, as well as Prasad's talk earlier. So we will open the chat line for the next 10 minutes, and you can actually post any of your questions up live to us, and we will be accepting these questions. I think Prasad's favorite 17 unsung hero of collaboration for the climate is certainly one at this platform with the various persons and people involved is something that we can move forward to. And if there's any questions with regards to the green bonds or climate bond, I foresee there are certain opportunities for big waste to energy, green infrastructure projects that can actually look carefully at the green bonds and climate bonds. With the aspect of governance in terms of cooperation, I think Bank Negara, for those who have already been involved at the securities level as well as Bank Negara, knows that there is a series of guidelines that have already been put out to big corporations governing the way forward in terms of adopting the financial transition. I don't see any questions. So I don't think there's any questions in the Q&A. I'd like to pass on to Ahmad.
Well, it seems that we have just concluded day 2 of the conference, all right? But stay with us for the next 2 days because good things are coming. Okay, tomorrow we will continue on segment B, the continuation, okay? And we will have people from the States, we will have people from Korea, and we will have our local representatives to talk, to further talk on the green finances. All right. Okay. A couple of things before we go off. Okay. Segment B will start tomorrow morning at 9. Sorry, not 9. Okay, close to 9:45. All right. And continue with the moderated discussion further in the afternoon at 3. All right. And you are actually welcome to ask any questions to the speakers, okay, through the chat box. All right. And please, please, please visit the virtual booths. All right. There are virtual booths around. So you can actually visit them and look at new products and new services, green services, right? Okay, with that, we all go home and take a rest and be ready for tomorrow then, all right? Okay, thank you so much for your attention. Okay, thank you to all of the speakers. Thank you to the moderator, all right? Okay, we'll see you tomorrow.